Welcome to Trending in Education's The Neuroscience of Gratitude, aka Don't Be a Turkey. A few years back, we did a very popular episode on Thanksgiving titled Don't Be a Turkey, Learn to Be Grateful. This is a shout out to our ancestors who came up with that idea for a show. It's a great idea. So, building on that, I queried Gemini with the hot off the presses Gemini 3 model. Better AI in support of your human agency. Asked for some help talking about the neuroscience of gratitude. Did want to connect it to a book that I really liked called The Gap and the Gain. When you're thinking about Thanksgiving and you're thinking about why gratitude makes sense, why it's something we should learn, and that the practices around it are actually useful for brain health, for well-being, for resilience. Interestingly, in terms of the neurochemistry, I did find that in some ways, gratitude triggers serotonin in a way that's very similar to serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and Paxil, that whole class of antidepressants. I thought that was an interesting point. The concept of the gap and the gain, it comes from Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy. It's a pretty interesting framework. I'd recommend the audiobook. I thought it was quite interesting in that Dan is basically interviewing Dr. Hardy, and through their conversations that almost debrief after reading a chapter. I thought it was a pretty interesting format. Been thinking more about audiobooks as I've started to dabble in producing them. It's an interesting format and it's an interesting adjacency to what we do when we produce podcasts. But anyway, neuroscience of gratitude. What happens in your brain? Here's a nice handy table where basically the dopamine is your motivation, reward, prediction center. This is where, it motivates you to do more of it. So you want to try to get into these positive, they can become addictive. You almost want to become addicted to gratitude if you do it right. And there's some practices we'll talk about later. Practices? Talking about practices? Yes, I'm grateful for Allen Iverson. Then, as I mentioned, serotonin is one about mood stabilization and resource evaluation. I have enough. I am safe and content. This is in like the prefrontal cortex. This is something that a lot of like mental health is connected to. And then oxytocin, which is the bonding drug, the bonding neurotransmitter, the thing that's involved in motherhood and parenting and social bonding, building trust, inhibiting fear. And oxytocin's counterpart is the stress hormone, cortisol, adrenaline. And then, of course, there's a little bit of endorphins involved. I feel a sense of relief and ease when I am grateful. So that's the idea for today's episode. How do we connect the dots on some of these things? Applied neuroscience is something that I've been fascinated by. We'll include a link to my recent interview with Horatio Sanchez, who does a lot of K-12 consulting about neuroscience. Really interesting guy. He was talking about kind of in-group, out-group thinking and how some of that bias is wired into how our brains operate. Does feel like we're at the cusp of new insights around human brain functioning, neuroscience, physiology, all of those connections, so that we can start to train ourselves in good practices that can cultivate brain health and allow for optimal brain performance. And that's really the framework of the gap and the gain with the dopaminergic reward prediction error theory, which basically says that we're predicting a certain level of return and we're grateful when we get something better than expected. So this is in some ways arguing for going in with relatively low expectations so that you can be pleased. The other thing that I thought was really nifty about the gap and the gain is that future facing versus backwards facing. Can you teach yourself to be focused on kind of the recent past and understanding progress? Flipping out of our sort of base model, which is I'm thinking about what I don't have and I'm thinking about the near to semi-distant future, but it's the gaps that lead us to things like doom scrolling and always comparing ourselves to unrealistic goals, as opposed to flipping it in the other direction to develop a practice around gratitude where you're able to connect to those stories, connect to those things that really happened in your life that you're grateful for, That leads to the other point that came up in this research. I thought there was some really interesting stuff here around the hormones involved, the neural chemistry. They also talk about neural synchronization. The idea of connecting with other humans is really sort of central to some of what's involved in mirror cells and why you might enjoy watching a football game. Also, the vagus nerve and your heart rate come into play here. I mentioned endorphins earlier, but there's a connection. It's not isolated to just one part of your brain. But then you come back to this notion that you wire how you fire. And if you get the brain to fire in a certain way, it'll develop pathways and routines that can create positive feedback loops. That's part of the idea of understanding gratitude in more meaningful ways. This is pretty interesting too, the gap versus the gain neural comparison. So gap thinking, the reference point is an ideal future versus in the gain, the reference point is the past. The prediction error in terms of the gap is thinking my actual versus my ideal. There's a gap there, as opposed to the gain is looking in the past, my actual versus where I was in the past. There's actually progress. Dopamine is where you create those feedback loops. Dominant space in your brain is the ventral striatum and the MPFC, obviously. The hormonal profile is high serotonin and oxytocin, leading to contentment. And the long-term effects here, as opposed to learned helplessness and burnout, if you're focused too much on gaps between your actual self and your ideal self and hurdles you need to overcome in the future, if you can build more time in to think about what's going well for yourself, sort of bank your wins, appreciate them, you can teach yourself to be grateful about it. It's better to develop gratitude stories as opposed to lists. The idea that was going around for some time, even as like a parenting practice, can I raise my kid so that at the end of each day before he or she goes to bed, we talk about what they're grateful for from that day and they have to list 3 things. Problem with that is that the list becomes kind of rote and it becomes almost mechanical, as opposed to kind of reframing that in the context of a story. Basically, you'll habituate the list practice, but the story-based protocol. Andrew Huberman, who's a very popular ophthalmologist and neuroscientist out of Stanford. The Huberman Report is a huge podcast these days. But the idea is to shift your frame, shift the mechanism of the story, and shift the feeling associated with the story so that gratitude visit, the culmination of some of this can be in telling people you appreciate them. Huberman talks about raising grateful children. The framework is notice, think, feel, do. So you begin by noticing the gift. Then you think about who gave it to you. Was it hard for them? How did you get it? Then you ask, how does that make you feel? And then what do you want to do about those feelings? And how do you show the fact that you are feeling grateful? So between the practice of creating these narratives while steering clear of toxic positivity, avoiding, a gaslighting effect and sort of adopting more of a both end, you realize that I can understand that things can be hard, but I still can kind of reflect on it. My reaction is what I control. Notes of Viktor Frankl here in terms of I control how I react to my circumstances. I can be more conscious of what is beneficial to me, and I can be more grateful of the things that are giving me joy, giving me strength, giving me resilience, even if it is in fact my own response is something that I'm grateful for. The neuroscience of gratitude. Is it just a feeling or is it fuel? Exploring the neurochemistry of thanks, the gap and the gain mindset, and the science of the perfect nap. That wonderful mix of neurochemistry, psychology, and health. There's your brain, but then there's your brain on gratitude. The gratitude cocktail consisting of dopamine, makes you feel good about the process. You realize that practice pays off. Practice is perfect. You get a mix in the cocktail. You got a little serotonin in there, which is what minimizes your anxiety, gives you a sense of contentment and well-being. This is a similar neurochemical pathway that's leveraged in some antidepressants and some anti-anxiety medications, which I think is interesting. And then, of course, the bonding hormone. This is why, best case, the gratitude is combined with being around people you love so that you can feel the connection, the social connection that builds trust. Is it actually good for you? Yes, it is. Gratitude is not only the right thing to do, it's also good for you. It creates better sleep, lowers your cortisol, raises your oxytocin, lowers your cortisol, gets you into a good framework, and improves your pain tolerance. So again, you might need a little pain tolerance around Thanksgiving table, depending on where the conversation goes and who's there. Maybe you could learn to tolerate some of that pain. It reminds me of Mel Robbins' new book, which I just got. I haven't started listening to fully, but it's really about the theory of let them, not trying to control other people, letting people be who they are, and learning to kind of use that extra energy to kind of focus on your own growth and development. That then leads to this idea, The Gap and the Gain. Great book. Recommend the audiobook highly. Most high achievers are unhappy because they compare themselves against an ideal that they can't accomplish. It's what keeps them going, but they never quite get there. That's living in the gap. So like you're looking ahead, you're doom scrolling, you're comparing yourself to others. As opposed to living in the gain, you're comparing yourself to that inexperienced, less clever, less knowledgeable human who hadn't done all the stuff that I just did. So looking in your rearview mirror, in fact, makes you feel better about yourself. And then once you're able to kind of like reset, you're able to propel yourself forward. Can it be taught? Well, Hebs would say yes. Neurons that fire together, wire together. So it's a skill. It's not a trait. You want to get that way of thinking going. Do it through stories. Do it through narrative, which is something I'm trying to model a little bit here in today's episode. And then get in the practice of looking back on those gains and almost like reframing things to more of a place of abundance rather than scarcity, the gain as opposed to the gap. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's the science of passing out. How does gratitude, tryptophan, and football make us all pass out on our couches? Turns out tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, which converts to melatonin, might help you with your sleep. But tryptophan is not actually putting you to sleep. What is putting you to sleep is all of the other foods you eat, the pumpkin pie, the macaroni and cheese. You're carbing out. And then football and the desire for peace through really compelling narrative that is football. Running It Back is my sports podcast. Certainly grateful for that. Check that out. Before you know it, you're passing out. So here's this cocktail, which is tryptophan, carbs, and some gratitude. But if you don't have too many carbs and you go lean, you go for mostly just the white meat, maybe a little bit of turkey, probably some vegetables, but keep them lean. You'll be alert enough to tell gratitude stories and think about the things that you're grateful for when you're almost nodding off, but actually retaining your consciousness. This is all powered by the magic of Gemini. Didn't take too much work. I'll include links to as much of this as I can for folks in the show notes for the episode. So what am I grateful for? Well, one, I'm grateful for our listeners. I'm extremely grateful for the ability to do shows like this. But let me tell it more in a gratitude story framework, like we were just talking about before. This is the story of how trending in education got started. I worked for Kaplan for many years. I began as a test prep teacher and over time got more involved in e-learning, ed tech, online teaching, and really innovation around media delivery role. I wound up vice president of digital media there. And as part of that responsibility, I had to always keep an eye out for what's new and emerging. Are there any uses for some emerging capabilities? Can we skunk work something together and launch that for the world so that, we learn how to do it. And then also maybe there's a positive impact to our brand, our culture, and our objectives. So that's how Trending in Ed got started back in the fall of 2016. Relatively soon after, Slate, which is a sister company in Graham Holdings, bequeathed to us. They were moving to Brooklyn. They didn't really have room for their audio booth, their whisper booth. I believe it was referred to by Mike Pesca and others as the Chamber of Secrets. That was bequeathed to us at Kaplan. It was dropped a la Gods Must Be Crazy into a set of pods, like little office units, right outside of my office there in Midtown Manhattan. And much like The Gods Must Be Crazy, which is a great movie from back in the day, if you want to check it out, about a Coke bottle dropped over Africa and its implications, definitely gets your wheels turning. Similarly, when that kind of capability is dropped right outside your office, you feel obliged to use it. So myself, Brandon Jones, Dan Strafford was that initial crew who kind of put something together, got Trending in Ed started back in 2016. 700 plus episodes later, here we are. And the Whisper booth, I'm not really sure where it's landed. I will say I was at a conference. I was at the Sound Education Conference organized by Zachary Davis, Adam Gamwell, and others up in Cambridge. I'm trying to get an episode together with Adam. Our conversation about robots, sci-fi, and the anthropological imagination from several years back has been popping. I think we kind of landed on something. And then similarly, I was at a panel, Sound Education, back in 2019, and was telling the story. And I noticed that Jacob Weisberg, who was the CEO of the Slate Group at the time, has moved on as the co-founder of Pushkin Industries with Malcolm Gladwell. But I was able to tell the story of gratitude about the Whisper booth being dropped outside my office to an audience that included the CEO of the company who gave this to a fellow part of Graham Holdings. I was able to thank Jacob Weisberg for his service. While I'm at it, I'd like to thank Andy Rosen, John Polstein, and Tim O'Shaughnessy, who allowed me to start the podcasting venture while I was at Kaplan, incubate my capabilities, and I've been able to successfully take that out on my own. So a lot of Thanksgiving for the folks who allowed me to kind of launch this stuff that I'm doing that I'm loving, and really thankful for the opportunity, thankful for you, the audience, who are able to listen to what we got going on. And then in terms of the other things that I'm thankful for is what this has allowed me and my family to do. We go to South by Southwest EDU every spring. We'll be back down there again, spring 2026. Trending in Ed was selected to be part of the podcast stage again. We'll launch our 16 March Madness of Learning Trends for 2026. I'll be joined by 3 surprise panelists, although they won't be a surprise by then. And we'll go at it. It's been amazing being able to bring my son there, beginning in 2023, then 2024. Then again, this year, 2025, he was 6. He's about to turn 7. So he's really kind of growing up with that conference. And these live experiences really are game-changing. And it's why I would recommend launching something like this. I do help folks launch podcasts and things like this. That's what I do as a consultant. That's really what keeps the lights on for things like Trending in Ed and other podcasts that I produce. In fact, just did a great live event for Jeremy Singer, who's the president of the College Board, who recently launched a podcast called The Education Equation. And he interviewed Liz Cohen, who wrote a wonderful book, The Future of Tutoring. I recently had Liz on my podcast, and then I was able to produce and edit the live episode that Jeremy recorded with Liz as part of the College Board's forum at the Marriott Marquis, right in Times Square in the heart of New York. When you're able to bring those live experiences, like my memory of Sound Education from Cambridge, Massachusetts back in 2019, to fast forward to just recently, back in November, with Jeremy and the College Board team interviewing Liz in front of a really engaged live audience of 50 guests who all got a copy of the book. It's a pretty powerful thing you can do if you launch these capabilities. And if you're interested, please reach out to me. I'd love to help you. Got some interesting projects in the pipeline, but I'm going to hold off on spilling any beans until we're actually live with some of what's new and going on. One thing that is coming that I do want to talk about is Trending in Higher Ed, which I mentioned. I was out in Chicago at the end of September for Collegius and Google's event Disrupt Ed, where a bunch of higher ed leaders and folks from, market analysts and folks from ASU Ed Plus and folks from Collegius and other research functions, folks from Google. We all assembled there, and I was able to record a bunch of interviews, 6 of them. In fact, that'll be dropping as part of a new dedicated Trending in Higher Ed feed. Trending in Ed's still going to be the main feed. You can catch everything from the central feed. We'll be spanning all sorts of ranges, K-12, early childhood, lifelong learning, workforce, and higher ed. But if you really just want to go deep on your focus, that's why we're launching Trending in Higher Ed, and you'll see more sub-feeds launching as we head into 2026. So that's exciting. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for these live experiences. The other live experience to talk about was back in October. I was able to be the virtual MC, the Ryan Seacrest or Snoop Dogg at the Paris Olympics for the New York State School Boards Association's annual conference. That was at the Hilton in Midtown. It's just a special experience. You remember these things. I was able to run a couple of rounds, pretty compelling school board Jeopardy, which, as a Kaplan test prep guy for years, that tugs at my heartstrings as a trivia guy, 4-time Kaplan trivia champion, in fact. Got to figure out how to bring more of the trivia back to our game from time to time. The AIs are getting much better at doing research and helping us get our thinking started. They can help us create trivia questions and keep our listeners and guests on their toes. So figure out how to build more of that back into what we deliver here as part of Trending in Ed. And then what else we have on the horizon? I'm going to be heading down for another live event. I'll be down at the Westin in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. for the National Youth Apprenticeship Summit. We'll be recording a live episode of Trending in Ed that'll be coming out in a few weeks after we're down there. But it's that same thing. If you want to do something that kind of livens up an event, if you want to record a mini season, a mini series worth of content at your conference, reach out to me. Let me know if you're curious about launching this for your brand like Jeremy did or David Adams did a few years ago. David Adams is the CEO of the Urban Assembly here in New York. He launched a podcast called Innovations in Education with David Adams. I interviewed David in person at the Urban Assembly's offices. That episode will be coming out in early December. Here's a little clip from that. Welcome to a very special episode of Trending in Education. I'm here with many-time guest, David Adams. David, welcome back to Trending in Ed.
I think I'm 5 times SML style.
I know. I need to get you like the jacket. I need to dial it up.
Every time it gets better, Mike.
So that's David, amazing guy. Really interesting podcast. That connection between social emotional learning, vocational tracks, and now college readiness powered by AI. Really interesting work David's doing. I feel very grateful for my relationship there and what we've been able to build in terms of authentic interviews and messaging around what's emerging in public education in K-12, people who are actually doing the work. So anyway, a lot going on. I mentioned audiobooks before. I'm producing an audiobook for Elliot Felix, who just wrote The Connected College. Had Elliot on the podcast a little while back. Still helping other folks out there who are working on things like the work that I did with AJ Gutierrez for Saga Education, launching the Ed Heads podcast. We're hoping to bring that pod back. AJ's landed with Equal Opportunity Schools. Recently had AJ on the podcast, might be developing something similar to Ed Heads, may even be able to bring it back to life in 2026. We'll see. More to come in the coming month. I have Sunana Shen from Teach for America's Reinvention Lab. Really had an amazing conversation with her. Josh Jones, the CEO of QuantHub. Really interesting AI and workforce conversation. That's on the horizon. And also Stephanie Smith Badai and Marie K. Heath talked to me about their book, Critical AI in the Classroom, really getting into some cool frameworks, John Lewis, bell hooks, stuff that really piqued my curiosity, piqued my interest. Subscribe to Trending in Ed to stay on top of all this. Be on the lookout for Trending in Higher Ed if you just want that substrand, if you just want to go deep on that varietal of Trending in Ed. There'll be more around K-12, Trending in Ed AI, some of the books that we covered This will be our 63rd episode in 2025, looking to do about the same in 2026. Keep stuff coming down the pike, always be shipping. That's how you learn, that's how you get feedback, and that's how over time you start to synthesize, pull it all together, and hopefully identify some cool and emerging trends that folks may not notice unless they're able to kind of assimilate all this information. So be on the lookout for our 2026 Trends show. We're going to try to do some recommendations on holiday gifts as parents and as learners. And of course, we're open to your feedback. We'd love to hear more. If you listen to the show, I'd love to hear from you, maybe get you on the show. We have had listeners as guests. Love to get some more of that going. This is Trending in Ed. Love what we're doing. We're grateful for it. It's making our brains better. It's warming our cockles. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Ed.